Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Gaetano Reina, the reserved yet influential figure whose quiet authority and steady resolve helped shape the early foundations of New York's underworld. Before we begin, make sure to like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes. And don't forget to share your city and the time you're listening down in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of Gaetano Reina guide you into the night. On a warm night in New York City, long after the streetcars stopped ringing and the shops pulled down their metal gates, the city did something it almost never does. It went quiet. A few cars rolled past, their tires whispering on the pavement. Somewhere a radio played softly from an upstairs window, a faint melody drifting over the rooftops. Most people were home, behind doors bolted for the night, trying to rest before another long day. But there was a time when, in certain parts of this city, the quiet never felt safe. In those days, silence meant deals being made in back rooms, footsteps in dark hallways, messages passed in low voices. Names traveled softly from mouth to ear, avoided in public, spoken clearly only among those who understood what they meant. One of those names belonged to a man who rarely raised his voice, rarely appeared in newspapers, and almost never spoke more than he had to. Yet his decisions shaped whole neighborhoods. He did not look like the terrifying figure of a storybook villain. He was a small, serious man who built his life step by step, first with honest work, then with work that made the law watch him closely. Most families in his part of the Bronx knew his trucks, his businesses, his reputation. They bought ice that kept their food from spoiling, coal that warmed their rooms. And they understood that behind those simple goods stood a man whose favor could be useful, whose anger could be dangerous. Tonight, as you lie down and let your eyes grow heavy, we are going to walk backward through time, before the city had skyscrapers that pierced the clouds, before refrigerators hummed in every kitchen, to meet that man. His name was Gaetano Reina, sometimes called Tommy, and though he tried to stay in the shadows, his life became part of the story of how organized crime took root in America. This is not a tale of heroes, nor a celebration. It is a calm look at how one boy from a poor Sicilian town grew into a quiet but powerful figure in New York's underworld, and how the choices he made pulled many others into danger. Far from the noise of Manhattan, in the hills of Sicily, the story began. Gaetano Reina was born on the 27th of August, 1889, in the town of Corleone, in the province of Palermo. Corleone was not yet the name whispered in films and novels. It was a small place of stone houses and narrow streets, where most people worked the land and lived from harvest to harvest. Fields of wheat turned golden under a hard sun, olive trees clung to rocky soil, and families struggled to pay rents to landowners who seldom knew their names. In that corner of Sicily, law was something distant. Local police existed, but many poor farmers believed the real power belonged to men who did not wear uniforms. These were figures who brokered deals, settled disputes, and offered protection that often blurred into control. From a young age, children learned not to speak lightly about such matters, not to repeat what adults said in private. Silence, loyalty, and carefulness could mean the difference between safety and trouble. Reina grew up in that atmosphere of caution. There are not many detailed records of his boyhood, and he did not leave behind letters or diaries. What we can see is the larger picture around him. At the end of the 19th century, Sicily was poor, unstable, and full of uncertainty. Landless farmers faced high taxes, bad harvests, and very few chances to rise out of poverty. The new Italian government struggled to control rural areas, and any person who seemed capable of helping, whether by honest or dishonest methods, could gain influence. Like thousands of other Sicilians, the Reina family looked across the sea. Stories drifted back from America of wages paid in dollars, of streets filled with work, of cities that needed strong backs and willing hands. The journey was long and risky, but staying promised only more of the same hunger and frustration. Around 1904, when he was about 15, Gaetano boarded a ship bound for the United States. The voyage would have taken weeks in cramped, crowded quarters. Families huddled together on hard bunks, Seasick passengers clung to railings, and hopes for a better future had to survive the stench and boredom of the crossing. Many of those travelers could not read or write, but they carried with them names of cousins, villages, and addresses scribbled on paper that would guide them in the new world. The ship finally slid into New York Harbor, and the Statue of Liberty came into view. For many immigrants, this was a moment they never forgot. A towering figure holding a torch over a bay lined with ships, smoke rising from factories in the distance. Before they could set foot in the city, however, they had to pass through Ellis Island, where inspectors checked names, eyes, and pockets. Some were turned away. Others, like young Gaetano, passed and joined the thick stream of newcomers flowing into the streets of Manhattan. Reina settled in East Harlem, one of the crowded Italian neighborhoods that had formed on the northern end of Manhattan. Tenement buildings pressed close together. Families shared small apartments, sometimes several to a room. Laundry hung out of windows. Street vendors shouted in Italian dialects. Women carried baskets from bakeries and markets, while men lined up each morning outside factories, hoping to be chosen for a day's work. The jobs available to someone like Reina were hard and low-paying. He might have carried bricks at a construction site, hauled goods down to the docks, or pushed heavy carts of produce through the busy streets. Italian immigrants often faced prejudice and insults, were paid less than other workers, and were blamed for crimes they had not committed. Police attention focused on their neighborhoods, yet protection from real threats often felt out of reach. In that tight, harsh world, some people saw another path. Long before Gaetano arrived, a Sicilian criminal organization had begun to transplant itself to New York. It was not yet the highly structured mafia that would be widely known later, but it already had clear rules: loyalty to the group, secrecy in front of outsiders, and obedience to a leader often called a boss. These men offered what they described as protection to shopkeepers and workers. They took a share of profits from illegal lotteries, unlicensed bars, and gambling tables in the backs of cafes. Around the same time, a rough form of extortion known in the newspapers as the Black Hand plagued Italian communities. Letters demanding money would arrive, decorated with crude symbols of danger. If victims refused, their shops might be vandalized or they might be attacked. Some of these letters were the work of lone criminals. Others involved more organized groups. In East Harlem, one of the strongest organizations was led by Giuseppe Morello and his half-brothers, the Terranovas. Morello's group controlled counterfeiting operations, loan sharking, gambling, and extortion in parts of the neighborhood. They blended into the immigrant crowd, running cafes and shops that acted as meeting points. The law suspected them, but struggled for solid proof. Gaetano Reina, as a young man trying to survive, moved in streets where these men were impossible to ignore. Their presence was visible in who walked untouched, who received respect in the cafes, who could settle a dispute with a short conversation instead of a long court case. For a boy from Corleone who had grown up hearing about local power brokers, the pattern in East Harlem would have felt familiar. Sometime in the first decade of the 20th century, Reina became connected to the Morello organization. The exact path is unclear. Maybe he began as a simple helper, carrying messages or collecting payments from gambling spots. Perhaps he used his knowledge of Sicilian customs and language to act as a bridge between older bosses and newer immigrants. However it started, by the 1,910 seconds, police and later historians would place him firmly within that world. With that connection came involvement in crime. As part of the Morello Circle, Reina participated in activities that broke American law. Extortion from local businesses, control of illegal gambling operations, and threats used to keep victims silent. The organization earned money by exploiting fear among people who had nowhere else to turn. If a fruit vendor refused to pay for so-called protection, his stand might be overturned or his goods ruined. If a cafe owner tried to open without permission, trouble would appear at his door. There is no record of Reina boasting about these things. He was remembered later as quiet, careful, always watching. This calm surface, however, did not mean innocence. His rise in the group depended on proving himself reliable in work that enforced the will of his superiors, whether by talk or by force, while details of specific incidents are lost. Law enforcement later believed he played a role in intimidation campaigns that kept East Harlem's Italian quarter under the grip of the Morello clan. By the middle of the 1,910 seconds, New York's Italian underworld was not united. On one side stood the Morello-based Sicilian Mafia in Manhattan. On the other were Neapolitan groups known collectively as the Camorra, strong in Brooklyn. Both wanted control of profitable rackets, gambling, loan sharking, and the flow of cheap labor at the docks. What followed is often called the Mafia-Camorra War, a series of killings and betrayals between 1915 and 1917 that left bodies in the streets and panic in the immigrant press. During this conflict, Reina remained on the Sicilian side. Evidence suggests he acted as a trusted associate of the Morello family, helping maintain their interests while open confrontation with the Camorra flared. The war played out through ambushes, quiet shootings in side streets, and the disappearance of men who had chosen the wrong ally. Newspapers reported the violence in broad strokes, talking about black-hand battles without understanding the internal rules guiding them. Again, it is important to keep things clear. The sources do not describe Gaetano personally carrying out specific killings. However, by aligning with the Morellos, he supported a network that planned and ordered such acts. He benefited when rivals were eliminated and when his side expanded its control. In later years, when the government finally broke parts of the Camorra thanks to informants, the Sicilian organization stepped into the space left behind. Reina, as one of their younger but reliable lieutenants, gained standing. With the Camorra weakened and key figures imprisoned, the Sicilian groups felt new confidence to expand beyond East Harlem. Around this time, Reina turned his attention to the Bronx, a borough across the Harlem River that was growing fast. New tenements were rising, and Italian families were moving in large numbers. Streets filled with push carts and small groceries. Coal cellars needed to be filled before winter, and blocks of ice had to be delivered daily to keep food from spoiling in iceboxes. Reina saw opportunity in those needs. He became involved in the ice and coal business, first as a participant, then as a controller. On the surface, these looked like ordinary, even helpful enterprises. Trucks loaded with heavy blocks of ice rumbled through the Bronx. Workers chopped and carried chunks up to apartments, where housewives waited with buckets and metal-lined boxes. Coal dealers sold the black fuel that kept heaters glowing in cold months. Reina either owned or silently partnered in many of these companies. Behind that everyday activity, however, was a system built on intimidation. Reports from the time and later investigations show that Reina did not simply compete with other ice dealers. He used his criminal connections to pressure or drive them out. Drivers who belonged to his circle might threaten rival suppliers, slash their tires, or scare their customers. Families in some neighborhoods were discouraged from buying ice from anyone but Reina's approved vendors. Those who ignored the warnings risked harassment. Through these tactics, he assembled what amounted to a monopoly over ice distribution in large sections of the Bronx and parts of East Harlem. The money from this control flowed steadily. Even poor families needed ice almost every day in hot weather. Grocers required it to keep meat from spoiling. Bakeries used it to cool their products. Week after week, coins piled up from thousands of small payments. What looked like a simple delivery business became a lucrative criminal racket. Law enforcement slowly took notice. Detectives understood that something more than ordinary business competition was happening, but it was hard to prove. Shopkeepers feared testifying. Workers knew that speaking out could bring punishment not just on them, but on their relatives. Reina, who preferred to avoid public attention, kept his name off many documents, operating through fronts and associates. To most neighbors, he was a serious, well-dressed man with interests in ice and coal, someone you did not argue with. Through his growing income, Reina strengthened his position within the larger Sicilian underworld. He supplied loans to smaller operators, invested in other rackets, and built loyalty among men who worked his trucks and guarded his territory. His criminal activities during these years consisted largely of extortion through exclusive arrangements, protection payments, and involvement in illegal gambling tied to his delivery routes. The Iceman, after all, knew every building and every pocket of the neighborhood. As the 1910 seconds drew to a close, another force was about to reshape organized crime in America: Prohibition. In 1920, the United States banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic drinks. For many citizens, this law was meant to improve society. For people like Gaetano Reina, it opened the door to a new level of illegal profit. Before that chapter began, he had already transformed from a young immigrant laborer into a quiet power in the Bronx, a man whose trucks carried both blocks of ice and the weight of fear. By then he had a family, a circle of loyal men, and a reputation that reached beyond his own streets. The boy from Corleone had become a boss in his own right, standing at the edge of a new era in which his crimes and the violence tied to them would leave deeper marks on New York City. By the early 1922, nights in the Bronx had changed. Saloons that once glowed openly on the corners now sat in darkness, their front doors locked, windows covered. Yet behind curtains and down basement staircases, the noise of clinking glasses still drifted out. People whispered passwords, knocked twice at the right door, and slipped into crowded rooms where music played and bottles moved quickly from hand to hand. On the streets above those hidden bars, thick horseshoes of ice still rested on men's shoulders. Coal dust still floated in the air near cellar chutes. Trucks bearing the names of delivery companies rolled past corner groceries and tenements. To most eyes, these wagons carried nothing more than frozen blocks and black fuel. To men like Gaetano Reina, they also offered the perfect disguise. In 1920, when the United States outlawed the sale and transport of alcoholic drinks, the law created an enormous new black market. People did not stop wanting wine, whiskey, or beer. They simply had to get them in secret, paying whatever price their suppliers demanded. That new demand drew in every level of the criminal world, from small-time thieves bottling cheap spirits in back rooms to larger organizations that could manage shipments, storage, and payoffs to corrupt officials. Reina had already built a network of delivery routes across the Bronx and parts of East Harlem. His ice and coal crews visited almost every block, every day. They knew which buildings had well-used basements, which shop owners could be trusted, which policemen looked the other way. When Prohibition arrived, he recognized that his existing system could be adapted to a new product. He did not become a producer of alcohol on the scale of some other underworld figures who ran giant hidden distilleries in warehouses or remote barns. Instead, his strength lay in distribution and control. Smaller producers and smugglers who brought liquor from Canada across the border or shipped it by boat up through coastal inlets needed reliable partners to move their product into New York's neighborhoods. Reina's men, with their ice trucks and coal wagons, could carry bottles in false compartments or under legitimate loads, making them less likely to be searched. Speakeasies in the Bronx learned quickly that if they wanted to stay open without harassment from local criminals, they would need to deal with the group around Reina. Some owners paid a regular fee to be left alone. Others allowed his people to supply all their liquor, even when it was more expensive than alternatives. The arrangement had a simple logic. Cooperation meant smoother business. Refusal meant trouble. Trouble did not always take the shape of violence. Sometimes it came as sudden visits from city inspectors, tipped off about fire code violations. Sometimes it meant mysterious shortages, as shipments intended for a bar disappeared along the way. Deliveries got lost, then reappeared in places under Reina's influence. Those who pushed back faced harsher messages, broken windows, vandalized equipment, threats made in low voices in alleys. Everyone understood the meaning without needing explicit detail. Even while he expanded into liquor, Reina did not abandon the trade that had first given him sway, the ice racket. In many Bronx neighborhoods, rival suppliers found themselves cornered. Drivers working for other companies reported being followed. Their customers warned that doing business with them was unsafe. Some owners simply gave up and sold their routes to men connected to Reina. In this way, the line between legal and illegal blurred. The product ice was lawful, yet the method of controlling it depended on pressure and fear. Inside the loose structure of New York's Sicilian underworld, he was no longer just another soldier. After the decline of the old Morello regime, a new, dominant figure emerged in the city. Salvatore d'Aquila, a Sicilian from Villabate who became recognized by many as a kind of coordinator or boss of bosses among Italian-American gangs. D'Aquila wanted trustworthy allies in every borough. For the Bronx, with its growing Italian population, he looked to Reina. By the early 1922, Reina headed his own organization, later known to law enforcement as a separate crime family. Most of his trusted men came from Sicily or had parents from there. Names that would later become well known in Mafia history began to cluster around him. Among them were Gaetano Tommy Gagliano, a calm, calculating figure who served as a close advisor, and Gaetano Tommy Lucchesi, a younger but ambitious associate who proved skillful in both negotiation and enforcement. Under this structure, Reina's group divided responsibilities. Some men focused on the ice and coal operations. Others concentrated on loan sharking, gambling, and now the liquor trade. They held meetings in back rooms of cafes, in corners of social clubs, and in apartments above storefronts. Officially, these gatherings were just friends sharing food and cards. Unofficially, they settled disputes over territory, set prices, and decided how to respond when someone challenged their interests. Despite the widening scope of his activities, Reina tried to keep himself out of newspapers. Unlike some bootleggers who paraded in expensive suits and flashy cars, he preferred a quieter style. He lived in the Bronx, near the areas he controlled, in a home that was comfortable but not outrageous. Neighbors knew him as a serious man who dressed neatly, spent time with his family, and spoke in a low, even voice. To those outside his circle, he might have appeared as a modest businessman who had done well for himself in America. Inside his household, life followed a more traditional pattern. He had married a Sicilian woman, Angelina, and together, they raised children. He wanted them to attend school and speak good English, to move easily in a society that still looked down on their parents' accents. In later accounts, relatives recalled that he could be affectionate at home, insisting that the children eat properly, study hard, and respect their mother. Yet the money that paid for their clothes and their future came from activities that placed many others in fear and put him in constant danger. Police in New York were not blind to the patterns forming around him. Investigators in the Bronx noticed that certain routes belonged solely to one set of ice trucks, that specific cafes survived raids while others were closed, that speakeasy owners often mentioned the same names when pressed in private conversations. Detectives attempted to bring charges for racketeering and extortion, but success was rare. Witnesses refused to testify, whether from loyalty, intimidation, or both. Many cases faded when key figures suddenly could not be found or forgot what they had seen. Sometimes Reina himself appeared in front of a judge for minor matters, violations of business regulations, suspicious gatherings in clubs, alleged threats made in arguments. Yet major convictions eluded authorities. He had learned from earlier, louder bosses that drawing attention was dangerous. He let others be the public faces of certain operations while he kept his own hands, at least on paper, relatively clean. Within Sicilian circles, his reputation for calm decision-making grew. He had little patience for wild, impulsive violence, not because he rejected brutality itself, but because he understood that uncontrolled attacks brought more heat from police, newspapers, and politicians. When one of his men injured or killed someone without proper approval, Reina could respond with harsh discipline. According to later testimonies gathered by informants, he believed punishment should be certain and measured, not random. That did not mean his group avoided bloodshed. The 1,920 seconds in New York saw many unsolved killings tied to disputes over liquor shipments, gambling dens, and territory. Men connected to rival outfits were found shot in back stairwells, in parked cars, or on lonely stretches of road outside the city. In police reports and press articles, these cases were often described simply as gangland murders, with little detail about the private feuds behind them. On several occasions, detectives quietly wrote Reina's name in their notes as someone who might have ordered or approved such actions, even when they could not prove it. As his organization grew stronger, he began to move beyond neighborhood-level rackets. One method was to reach into labor unions. Control over unions meant control over which companies got contracts, how quickly work moved, and how often strikes disrupted business. In industries connected to his ice and coal dealings, such as building maintenance and delivery, influence over union leaders allowed him to pressure building owners and competing firms. A threat of a walkout at the start of summer, when ice was most needed, could be a powerful bargaining tool. Another step involved the shadow economy of loans. Immigrant families who could not get credit from banks often turned to private lenders. Reina's men offered money at high interest rates, backed not by legal contracts but by the threat of retaliation. Those who fell behind on payments might find their shops vandalized or their relatives confronted. This kind of lending, known later as loan sharking, brought steady income while deepening the organization's control over small businesses. In all of this, Reina remained tied to higher-level power struggles among New York's Italian gangs. For much of the decade, he recognized the authority of Salvatore de Aquila, attending meetings where disputes between groups were negotiated, D'Aquila tried to keep a balance, preventing large-scale warfare by forcing rival leaders to compromise. Reina, with his reliable income from the Bronx, was valued as a steady partner who could supply money and manpower when needed. Yet stability at the top did not last. On a September evening in 1928, D'Aquila was shot and killed on a Manhattan street, a sign that the upper structure of the Sicilian underworld was shifting again. The killing was widely believed to have been arranged by Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria, a tough, old-style gangster from Sicily who had grown powerful on the Lower East Side. With D'Aquila gone, Masseria moved to claim his place as the chief figure among New York's Mafia leaders. For Reina, this change carried heavy consequences. As head of a Bronx family, he now had to navigate pressure from Masseria, who expected absolute loyalty from those under him. At the same time, a challenge to Masseria's rule was forming among another group of Sicilian immigrants, many from the town of Castellammare del Golfo in western Sicily. Their leading figure, Salvatore Maranzano, had begun to gather support in Brooklyn and beyond. Reina knew both sides. His long years in the underworld had taught him that picking the wrong ally in such a conflict could be fatal. Masseria's men visited him, stressing that his position and rackets depended on their favor. Messages also came from the Castellammare's faction, hinting that the time had come to oppose the old boss and create a new order. Men like Tommy Gagliano and Tommy Lucchese watched these developments carefully, understanding that whatever choice their leader made would shape their own futures. Outwardly, life in the Bronx went on much as before. Ice trucks kept rumbling down cracked streets in summer heat. Secret bars still poured drinks into the early hours. Loan collectors still knocked on doors at the end of each month. But beneath that surface, the air was thickening with unease. The quiet, calculating man who had risen from a poor Sicilian boy to a powerful figure in New York's hidden world now stood between competing storms, trying to avoid being crushed as they gathered around him. On summer evenings in the late 1922, the Bronx felt thick with life. Children played stickball between parked cars until the sky went violet. Women leaned on windowsills, talking in rapid Italian and broken English. The calls of street vendors mixed with the distant hum of trains. Down below, the rumble of delivery trucks never seemed to stop. Among those vehicles were the familiar wagons tied to Gaetano Reina's interests. His ice companies had painted names on their sides, respectable enough that no one looked twice when they backed into alleys or stopped at basement doors. To most residents, they were a simple part of daily survival. For the men who worked those routes, they were also moving pieces in a hidden system that now reached into nearly every corner of the borough. By this time, Reina was no longer just a local tough. He was in his late 30s, a settled figure, quietly recognized across the Italian neighborhoods as the man who decided who could run games, who could deliver supplies, who needed to pay protection. Through years of quiet pressure and steady earnings, while other gang leaders posed for photographs in sharp suits and fed newspaper stories, he preferred to stay off the front page, meeting his people in the shadows of cafes and in small social clubs that blended into the block. The trucks under his control did more than carry ice. Couriers used the same routes to move cash from gambling dens, to deliver envelopes with payoff money to sympathetic officials, and in some cases to shuttle illegal liquor from one safe stash to another. A driver might begin his morning loading genuine ice at a warehouse, then stop at a storage room to pick up concealed boxes of alcohol before heading into his regular rounds. Customers saw only what they expected: a sweating man hauling a dripping block up the stairs. Alongside the delivery outfits, clubs linked to Reina hosted card games and small dice tables. Neighbors thought of them as places where workers unwound after long shifts, playing for modest stakes. In truth, the money that passed over those tables each week added up to serious profits. House cuts from those games, tiny as they seemed, flowed upward through Reina's chain of trusted men. If an outsider tried to open his own game in Reina's territory, he quickly learned that such freedom did not last long. Either he paid a share to Reina's group, or the game disappeared. Behind the scenes, the organization had taken on a more formal shape. At the top sat Reina himself. Under him were key lieutenants, men he had known for years. Gaetano Gagliano, cautious and deliberate, and the younger Gaetano Lucchese, sharp-eyed and ambitious. Below them worked a layer of street-level figures who collected payments, enforced rules, and kept watch over the different neighborhoods. Everyone understood his place. Information and money moved upward, Orders and instructions moved down. In a typical week, Reina might spend time in his legitimate office, reviewing bills from coal suppliers or ice factories, then slip away for a quiet meeting in the back of a restaurant. There, over plates of pasta and coffee, he would listen to reports. A grocer who had missed 2 weeks of protection payments. A bar owner who was considering buying liquor from a cheaper rival. A policeman who might be growing suspicious. He rarely raised his voice. Instead, he asked questions, weighed options, then gave short, clear instructions. If a shopkeeper simply needed a reminder, a polite but firm visit could be arranged. If someone had openly defied his authority, a harsher example might be required. This could mean vandalized property, broken fixtures, or, in more extreme circumstances, a beating delivered in a side alley at night. Reina did not personally carry out such punishments. He did not have to. His authority rested on the certainty that, when he made a decision, his men would carry it out. Around him, the immigrant neighborhoods continued to live ordinary lives. Children went to school. Parish churches held Sunday processions. Markets bustled with buyers haggling over fruit and fish. Yet underneath that surface, the grip of his criminal network tightened. Ice dealers who had once been independent found themselves squeezed until they either joined his system, paid a fee, or shut their doors. Small business owners learned that licenses and inspections seemed to go smoother if they were on good terms with certain friends. Reina's own home life reflected a different side of him. He had married and started a family. Their apartment showed the modest comfort of someone who had escaped the worst poverty, but did not flaunt wealth. His children grew up speaking both Italian and English, wearing clothes that fit well, attending school more regularly than many of their classmates. Relatives later remembered that he wanted them to succeed in the American way, to have choices beyond the hard labor and rough streets that had shaped his own youth. Still, duplicity ran through that daily routine. The man who sat at the dinner table as a father and husband was also a figure deeply involved in extortion, illicit gambling, and the liquor traffic. He walked a narrow line, trying to keep his loved ones shielded from his darker world. He rarely discussed business at home. He did not bring his harshest enforcers around his children, yet they could not help sensing the respect and fear that followed him when he walked through the neighborhood. Outside the Bronx, the larger landscape of organized crime was shifting. After Salvatore D'Aquila's death in 1928, power did not remain vacant for long. Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria stepped forward, pushing others aside, determined to be recognized as the top authority among the Sicilian gangs in New York. He had a reputation for direct threats, sudden anger, and an old-fashioned view of power. Allegiances that had once been spread among several bosses now had to be rearranged under him. Reina, as head of a substantial organization, was drawn into this new arrangement. On the surface, he accepted Masseria's supremacy. He attended meetings where Masseria sat at the center of the table, taking the best seat and often the choicest share of any deal. In those gatherings, rules were laid down. Which groups controlled which territories, how profits from certain large operations should be shared, who had permission to carry out retribution and under what circumstances. Behind closed doors, not everyone was comfortable with Masseria's leadership. Some considered him violent in a way that attracted too much attention. Others believed he favored his old associates over men who ran prosperous operations in other boroughs. Among those who quietly doubted him were members of a different Sicilian circle, the Castellamarese, tied to the town of Castellammare del Golfo. Their most prominent figure in America, Salvatore Maranzano, began to cultivate supporters who resented Masseria's heavy hand. Reina found himself standing between these two forces. He had long ties to D'Aquila's camp, which had not always agreed with Masseria in earlier disputes. Now that Masseria claimed to speak for all, Reina was expected to fall in line completely, turning over a large portion of his income and manpower whenever requested. The Bronx boss, known for his cautious nature, did not rush into open defiance. Instead, he weighed his options, listening to envoys from both sides. From Masseria's side came clear statements. Loyalty would be rewarded. Resistance, punished. From Maranzano's side came promises of a more modern arrangement, one that would reduce reckless violence and give more respect to each regional leader. Some historians later suggested that Reina, with his measured style and preference for quiet dealings, felt more comfortable with Maranzano's approach. There were rumors, never fully proven but widely believed, that he began to lean toward the Castellamarese faction. At the same time, everyday pressures did not lessen. Prohibition remained in force, and the scramble for control over alcohol routes grew fiercer. Trucks carrying liquor across state lines risked hijacking not only from law officers but also from rival gangs. Warehouses storing expensive whiskey had to be guarded. Even within the Bronx, Reina's men occasionally clashed with small-time operators who refused to follow his rules. Police noted a series of unsolved assaults and shootings in the late 1920 seconds that they linked, at least in their private files, to these turf disputes. One growing concern surrounding Reina's operations involved the ice racket that had given him his first major power base. By now, the monopoly his group held in parts of the Bronx was nearly complete. Restaurant owners who tried to acquire ice from cheaper suppliers found their deliveries mysteriously delayed or damaged. Tenement caretakers who signed contracts with outside companies heard late-night knocks on their doors, followed by quiet but firm advice to reconsider. Reina's organization also pressed further into labor circles. Men connected to his group began to appear in leadership roles in certain delivery and building service unions. Through these positions, they could influence which companies received work and how quickly disputes were settled. If a business owner refused to acknowledge Reina's quiet authority, labor problems might suddenly appear: strikes, sick-outs, or slowdowns that halted deliveries until the owner agreed to speak with friends who could help resolve the matter. Law enforcement, increasingly aware of the pattern, tried to push back. Investigators in the Bronx Police and the District Attorney's Office assembled reports on Reina's suspected domination of ice routes and his links to underground liquor distribution. They gathered statements, tapped informants, and watched known associates. Still, direct evidence tying him personally to threats or violence was scarce. Those closest to him were either loyal, frightened, or both. Without willing witnesses, prosecutors struggled to build a strong case. By 1929, tension in New York's underworld grew sharper. Rumors circulated of secret meetings between Maranzano's supporters and dissatisfied gang leaders. In the newspapers, individual killings were reported in dry, brief paragraphs: man found shot, unidentified person slain in street. But within the organizations, each death was weighed carefully. Who had been removed? Whose hand was behind it? Which side was gaining advantage? Reina tried to maintain a middle ground in public, honoring his formal obligations to Masseria while, according to later accounts, quietly edging nearer to Maranzano's camp. For a man of his temperament, seeking security and stability, the coming storm posed a dangerous puzzle. If he chose wrong, he risked everything he had built. If he refused to choose, he risked angering both sides. At home, the atmosphere must have felt strained, even if no one spoke openly about the danger. He continued to attend family dinners, appear at community events, and move through the streets with his usual reserved composure. Yet his drivers, his collectors, his closest advisors all sensed the shift. They watched visitors more closely. They paid extra attention to strange cars parked too long on their blocks. Men who had once walked confidently now glanced over their shoulders at night. Sometime during this period, Reina's personal life took a more complicated turn. Though married, he maintained a relationship with another woman in the Bronx, keeping an apartment where they met. Such arrangements were not uncommon among men in his world, but they added another point of vulnerability. Movements to and from that residence could be tracked. Enemies might learn his habits there more easily than around his main home, where his guard was higher. On the surface, business still prospered. The ice trucks ran on schedule. Payments from gambling, loans, and liquor distribution arrived regularly. Police, though suspicious, had not succeeded in breaking his organization. To an outsider looking only at the numbers, it might have seemed that Reina had reached a secure plateau, respected by allies, feared by rivals, financially comfortable, his crime family firmly rooted. In truth, the ground beneath him was already shifting. Masseria's circle, wary of betrayal, watched for any sign that one of the major New York bosses might desert him for Maranzano. The Castellamarese faction, seeking to strengthen its ranks, reached quietly toward those who seemed ready to change sides. Those in between were under constant study, their words weighed, their visitors noted. By the winter of 1929, 1930, whispers circulated that Reina was no longer fully trusted by Joe the Boss. Stories spread that he had delayed sending men when Masseria demanded them, or that he had spoken too warmly of Maranzano in private. Whether every rumor was accurate hardly mattered. In a world built on suspicion, even a hint of disloyalty could be enough to seal a man's fate. On a cold February day in 1930, Reina followed what had become a familiar pattern. He spent time in the Bronx, checked on aspects of his business, and then made his way to visit the woman with whom he kept his second household. The streets were chilly and gray, the sidewalks scattered with patches of snow that had turned dirty at the edges. He had no obvious reason to think that this day would be different from countless others spent balancing home life, business, and hidden pressures. What he did not know was that plans had already been set in motion around him. Somewhere in the city, among men loyal to Masseria, a decision had been taken. If the Bronx boss could not be relied upon completely, then he could not be allowed to remain in his position. An order went out. A shooter was selected. Arrangements were made to intercept him at a predictable moment, when he would be away from the tighter protection around his main home and offices. As dusk approached on February 26, Reina left the apartment building where he kept his second life. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on. Traffic was thin. He walked toward his car, thinking perhaps of the evening ahead, the dinner table he would soon join, the next day's small issues waiting to be settled. In that unremarkable moment, the long trail that had led from a boyhood in Corleone, through years of hard labor and deeper into crime, reached its sudden endpoint. The street outside the apartment house on Sheridan Avenue lay under a thin winter light when he stepped out. The air felt sharp on the skin, the kind of cold that reddens ears and makes each breath visible. Cars were parked along the curb, dusted with an old gray snow that still clung to their fenders. A few people hurried past with collars turned up, eager to reach warm rooms. Gaetano Reina pulled his coat a little tighter as he came through the doorway. For him, this stretch of sidewalk had become familiar. He had walked it many times between that building and his waiting car, thinking about business, family, and the delicate balances he tried to keep. Nothing in that late afternoon suggested that the pattern would break. He took a few steps toward his vehicle. Somewhere nearby, a bus rumbled, and a child shouted in the distance. Then a figure moved from a hiding place, closed the gap quickly, and raised a shotgun. At close range, a single blast struck Reina. He collapsed beside his car before he could call out or turn around. Residents heard the report echo off the building fronts, a heavy, cracking sound that did not match the usual city noise. Windows slid open. Faces appeared behind curtains. For a few moments, no one wanted to be the first to rush outside. Then curiosity and alarm pulled several people to the street. They found a man lying on the cold pavement, his hat fallen, his body still. Someone shouted for the police. Another person ran to a nearby phone to call an ambulance. The shooter was gone. In that world, nobody had much interest in explaining exactly what they had seen. A handful of witnesses later told officers they had noticed a stranger loitering earlier, or a car pulling away quickly after the shot, but details remained hazy. Fear and confusion blur memories. By the time uniformed officers arrived, a small crowd had formed at a distance. They kept back, watching in silence as detectives examined the scene. The body was identified as that of a local businessman named Tom, or Tommy Reina, known in the community as a man connected to the ice trade. Police officers with experience in the Bronx did not need to be told who he really was. Word traveled fast through the Italian neighborhoods. Men in cafes heard the news from hurried whisperers. They got Reina. In clandestine card rooms and backroom offices, the same phrase circulated, voiced with a mix of surprise, tension, and a hint of satisfaction from those who had not liked how powerful he had become. For people who depended on him for protection or work, the information landed with a nervous chill. The shield they had relied on, however compromised, had vanished in an instant. At his main home, the knock came at the door. One can only imagine the moment his wife, Angelina, saw the serious faces of the officers and understood that something terrible had happened. They told her that her husband had been shot and killed in the Bronx. Rumors about another household, another woman, were not part of that official message. The blow did not need any extra weight. Newspapers seized on the story. The next day, reports describing a gangland slaying appeared in the city's press. They listed his age, roughly 40, called him an ice dealer, and hinted at darker connections. Editors tied the killing to prohibition violence, and the shadowy struggle over control of illegal liquor and other rackets. Some stories spoke of a Mafia chief struck down in the Bronx. Others wrote more cautiously, noting only that he had been questioned in the past about underworld matters. The police investigation started along the same worn tracks these cases always followed. Detectives visited speakeasies, questioned gamblers, leaned on known associates in hopes of squeezing out a lead. They looked for anyone who had reason to want him dead. That list was not short. Competitors in the ice trade, rivals in the liquor business, victims of extortion, and other Italian gangs all had potential motives. But the pattern of the attack, sudden, precise, carried out in a setting linked to his private life, pointed to an inside understanding of his habits. Whispers inside law enforcement circles soon focused on one name: Joe, the Boss Masseria. Though they had no direct proof, many detectives believed the order had come from him. They knew that Reina had been part of the old tequila camp, that Masseria had forced his way into the top spot, and that rumors had spread of Reina drifting toward Salvatore Maranzano and the Castellamarese faction. To those who studied these things, the killing looked like a preemptive strike. Remove a potential traitor before he could openly switch sides. Names of possible triggermen circulated as well. One frequently mentioned by later accounts was Vito Genovese, an ambitious enforcer close to Masseria. Whether he was truly the one who pulled the trigger remains uncertain. The case never reached a courtroom with a clear, proven story. What is clear is that the man who fired the gun that day was never convicted for the crime. Like many underworld killings of that era, Reina's death officially remained unsolved. In the Bronx, his removal created an instant vacuum. Overnight, the capo who controlled ice routes, union ties, loan operations, and gambling spots was gone. Men who had answered only to him now looked around for direction. Would they be absorbed by another boss? Would someone from within Reina's circle step up? Or would a power struggle turn the streets dangerous? At first, outward calm held. There was no immediate wave of shootouts. Trucks still rolled, cards still turned, and collections continued, if only to keep cash flowing until a new arrangement could be made. Behind the scenes, the men closest to Reina met quietly, talking in low tones about what came next. For figures like Gaetano Gagliano and Gaetano Lucchese, his death was not just the loss of a leader. It was a warning about how quickly fortunes could reverse in their world. Masseria moved swiftly. According to later testimonies and historical reconstructions, he did not plan to let the Bronx operation drift into the orbit of his enemy, Maranzano. Instead, he sought to install someone loyal directly to him at the top of what had been the Reina family. That choice would come later. In the immediate aftermath, he wanted to demonstrate that the old rules still stood. Disloyalty, or even the suspicion of it, would be dealt with harshly. On the surface, the city shifted briefly into mourning. Reina's funeral drew a large turnout from the Italian community. The casket, modest but solid, was carried through streets, lined with curious onlookers and quiet neighbors. Flower arrangements surrounded his bier, sent by relatives, by front businesses he had owned, and by associates who knew better than to be absent on such a day. For many, attending the service was as much a political act as a sign of sorrow. Showing up signaled respect for what he had been, and perhaps shielded them from accusations of ingratitude. Inside the church, candles flickered. A priest spoke of life, death, and the hope of forgiveness. He did not dwell on rumors about the man before him. The homily stayed on the familiar ground of faith, family, and the brevity of earthly power. Yet everyone present understood that the man in the coffin had not lived a simple life. Some silently wondered if he had foreseen this ending when he chose, years earlier, to step deeper into organized crime, rather than keep to the hard, grinding path of lawful work. His widow, Angelina, and their children stood at the center of that grief. They had to endure not only the loss of a husband and father, but also the attention of police, reporters, and curious neighbors. Investigators approached them with questions about his habits, his recent worries, any mention he had made of threats. Out of loyalty, shock, or fear, the family said little of substance. They likely knew that speaking too freely about underworld matters could bring reprisal on their already wounded household. After the burial, the family faced a difficult adjustment. The comfortable living they had enjoyed, paid for by ice profits and hidden rackets, no longer had a clear source. Some money and property remained, held under Reina's name, or through associates. Yet without his guiding hand, those assets could be contested or even seized informally by more powerful figures in the Mafia. Over time, the Reina family, as a bloodline rather than a crime group, receded from public notice, blending into the broader Italian-American community. For the police, closing the file on his murder without securing a conviction felt like another defeat in a long struggle against organized crime. They could draw lines on charts connecting Reina to D'Aquila, D'Aquila to Masseria, and Reina's death to the rising conflict between Masseria and Maranzano. They could write internal memos speculating on the roles of various suspects. Yet in court, speculation was worthless. Without witnesses willing to point to a shooter, the case stagnated. Inside the Mafia, the message had already been absorbed. Reina had been a cautious, relatively understated boss, known for preferring quiet pressure over sensational violence. Even he could be removed when he seemed to stand in the way of a larger power's plans. Others in similar positions took note. Some drew closer to Masseria out of fear. Others decided that if such a man could fall, no one was safe, and began seeking their own alliances to survive what was becoming an open war. That war, which history would call the Castellamarese conflict, now moved into a more intense phase. Masseria and Maranzano both courted remaining leaders, trying to pull them to their side. Reina's old organization in the Bronx became one of the prizes to be claimed. Control of its income streams, ice racks, union ties, gambling dens, loan sharking, and a share in liquor distribution could tilt the balance of power. For a brief period, leadership of the Bronx rackets hung uncertainly. Men loyal to Reina's memory felt anger and anxiety. They suspected, even if no one said it openly, that the order to kill him had originated above, not from a minor quarrel on the street. Some wanted revenge. Others wanted only stability and safety in a dangerous season. Among them, Gagliano and Lucchese watched, weighed their options, and began to imagine a future not tied to Joe the boss. In those months, the echo of Reina's death continued to shape choices made in dark corners of New York. While his body lay in consecrated ground, his name remained on the lips of detectives, gangsters, and journalists. To some, he was a symbol of how deeply organized crime had rooted itself in the everyday life of the Bronx. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a man who had spent years building a quiet empire, only to fall the moment he seemed ready to drift from the orbit of a stronger Sunday. Years later, when younger men rose to power in New York's Mafia, they would inherit the structures he had helped build. The Bronx rackets, the ice and trucking routes, the patterns of influence over unions and businesses. His direct rule ended that cold February afternoon, but the organization that bore his imprint survived, reshaped under new hands. In that sense, his shadow lingered long after the newspapers stopped mentioning his name. In the weeks after the funeral, the cemetery on the edge of the city grew quiet again. The snow melted from the stones, leaving dark patches of damp earth around the graves. Sometimes, on certain afternoons, 2 or 3 men from the old neighborhood would come and stand by the fresh mound where Gaetano Reina lay. They rarely stayed long. They said a short prayer under their breath, looked around to see who might be watching, and then walked back toward the street in silence. For those men, the visit was not just about mourning. It was also a reminder of how quickly their world could turn. Only months earlier, they had taken orders from Reina, collected payments in his name, and felt that his influence gave them a measure of safety. Now, the person who had shaped their working lives was gone, taken away in a single winter evening. They still had to eat, still had families to support, still had debts to pay. The money that had once flowed to Reina would have to go somewhere else. On the streets of the Bronx, business did not stop. Tenants still needed coal, housewives still waited for ice, and backroom card players still gathered after dark. Drivers continued their routes, slipping blocks of ice onto stairway shoulders, smiling politely at customers who asked no questions about who truly owned the truck. Collectors still knocked on doors at the end of the week, reminding shopkeepers of overdue insurance payments. If anything, people felt more dependent on those arrangements. The economic crash of late 1929 had begun to squeeze the city, and small businesses were struggling. In that fragile moment, the question of leadership weighed heavily. Among Reina's closest lieutenants, 2 names stood out. Gaetano Gagliano, the quiet strategist who had handled many of the family's affairs, and Tommy Lucchese, the younger but increasingly influential associate whose sharp judgment had earned him respect. Both had worked closely with Reina for years. Both had a following among the soldiers and street-level men. But in their world, succession was not a simple matter of seniority or merit. Above the Bronx, Joe the Boss Mafia still claimed to be the ultimate authority in New York's Sicilian underworld. To him, Reina's death opened an opportunity. Instead of allowing an independent-minded lieutenant to rise, he decided to insert his own loyalist at the top of the Bronx organization. The man chosen was Joseph Fat Joe Pinzolo. He was not a stranger to the underworld. He had a background in illegal gambling and high-interest lending, and had been aligned with Masseria's camp. Yet he did not come from the Bronx. He had not worked the ice routes with Reina, had not built trust in those tenements, had not sat with worried grocers or negotiated with union men tied to those streets. When word spread that he would take care of the former Reina operations, the reaction among Reina's old guard was cool at best. Still, open defiance of a man like Masseria carried risks. Gagliano and Lucchese, whatever they felt privately, had to show at least outward respect. Pinzolo began appearing at meetings, sitting in the chair that had once been Reina's, reviewing books, asking questions about income, costs, and which businesses paid regular protection. He examined the flow of money from ice, coal, gambling, and loans. He wanted to be sure that a greater share reached Masseria's hands. For the men who had been personally loyal to Reina, the experience was unsettling. They had lost a boss they knew and, in their own hard way, trusted. In his place stood someone many viewed as an outsider, planted there by a higher power with little regard for the Bronx's delicate balance. Some believed that Pinzolo had known in advance about the plan to remove Reina. Whispers began to circulate that he had, at the very least, given his approval for the move, hoping to gain the position himself. Those suspicions, whether true or not, deepened resentment. In back rooms, Reina's old associates spoke carefully but firmly about their displeasure. They remembered the years of building the ice monopoly, the risks taken when they had muscled out competitors, and pried open the speakeasy trade. They felt that someone who had not shared those dangers now wanted to reap the rewards and, worse, divert part of their hard-earned share upward to Joe the Boss. Despite the tension, business carried on. Under the surface, the city had begun to slide into what would later be called the Great Depression. After the stock market crash, factories cut back, construction slowed, and ordinary families tightened their belts. Yet certain needs did not disappear. People still had to keep food cold. They still needed fuel in winter. Some even turned more heavily to gambling and drink as a way to forget their worries, making Reina's old rackets as relevant as ever. In that harsher economic climate, the darker side of those rackets became more visible. Loan sharking grew more ruthless. Shopkeepers who had once taken small loans from Reina's people to bridge a slow season now found themselves dealing with new collectors who showed even less patience. Interest piled up quickly. A missed payment brought a visit, and while the threats were still delivered in low voices, the edge in them had sharpened. The ice racket, too, weighed heavier. When money was tight, being forced to buy from a single, higher-priced supplier stung more sharply. While the Bronx simmered, the larger conflict in New York's Mafia world heated. The struggle between Masseria and the Castellamarese faction led by Salvatore Maranzano moved beyond isolated incidents into a sustained underground war. Murders occurred on both sides. Influential figures like Peter Morello and others close to old-line bosses were killed. Each act was a signal. One camp striking, the other striking back. Police could see that something large and organized was at play, but they did not grasp every connection. In their reports, they linked names, places, and times, trying to map a pattern. The public saw only headlines about another gangland slaying. Inside the networks themselves, every death carried hidden messages. Some killings warned potential defectors. Others removed key lieutenants. Rumors flowed as quickly as fear. In that environment, Reina's death took on more than just local meaning. To many, it symbolized how far Joe the Boss was willing to go to keep control. Men in the Bronx whispered that their former leader had been cut down not because of a simple business dispute, but because he had dared to lean, even slightly, toward Maranzano's side. The resentment that memory stirred did not fade with time. It quietly fanned a desire among some of his former followers to one day distance themselves from Masseria's dominance. The figure of Fat Joe Pinzolo now sat at the center of that resentment. He tried to secure his position, meeting with important soldiers, offering reassurance that their interests would be protected under his rule. He walked the narrow streets, visited clubs, and tried to project an air of authority. But he lacked the depth of personal history that Reina had had in those communities. Respect that comes from years of shared struggle cannot be created overnight simply by orders from above. On the 5th of September 1930, the uneasy arrangement came to a sudden end. That day, Pinzolo visited an office in Manhattan tied to Tommy Lucchese, a travel agency that also served as a discreet meeting space. It seemed like a business call, one more stop in the routine of a man trying to manage scattered enterprises. Inside that office, however, someone confronted him. A gun was drawn. Shots were fired. When the sound faded, Joseph Pinzolo lay mortally wounded on the floor. Once again, the police began their procedures. They secured the area, gathered shell casings, spoke to those who claimed to know little or nothing about what had just happened. Reporters soon arrived, notebooks ready, eager to write about another gang-related killing. The location, connected to an associate of the old Reina faction, immediately caught law enforcement's attention. Detectives linked the dots. The unpopular appointment after Reina's death, the simmering anger among Bronx men, and now the sudden end of Maseria's chosen replacement. Suspicions quickly settled on Lucchese himself. He was questioned closely. Yet, as in so many similar cases, direct proof remained elusive. He denied any involvement and presented an alibi. Some accounts later suggested that he had arranged to be elsewhere at the time, precisely so that he could not be tied legally to the shooting. In any case, the investigation stalled. No one was convicted. Officially, Pinzolo's murder, like Reina's, remained unsolved. For men on the inside, the meaning was clearer, even if spoken only in private. Someone from the old Reina circles had removed the outsider placed over them. It looked, to many observers, like an act of revenge and self-protection rolled into one, a way of avenging Reina's killing and at the same time cutting away a puppet of Joe the Boss. The Bronx organization now stood effectively leaderless again, but this time the gap did not last. Stepping forward with quiet certainty was Gaetano Gagliano. Long considered the brain behind many of Reina's operations, he now had the opportunity to guide the family himself. He did so with care, aware of the dangers that came with such a move. Officially, he kept a low profile, avoiding public boasts or large gatherings that might attract police attention. Within the organization, however, he was recognized as the new boss of the Bronx and East Harlem rackets that had grown under Reina. Under Gagliano, many of the existing structures remained in place. The ice monopoly continued, though in the early 1932 refrigerators slowly began to appear in wealthier households, hinting at a coming change. The group still influenced certain unions, still took shares from gambling dens, still ran high-interest loan operations. Those rackets had been built during Reina's years. Now they were refined rather than reinvented. In the ongoing Castellamarese War, Gagliano leaned toward Maranzano's camp. This was a logical extension of the quiet drift that had cost Reina his life. Yet he did so carefully, trying not to provoke a direct attack from Maseria before the balance of power shifted. As violence continued around the city, he focused on keeping his own territory stable and profitable, avoiding unnecessary bloodshed that could disrupt business. In April 1931, the long struggle between Joe the Boss and Maranzano reached its climax. On a spring afternoon in Coney Island, Masseria was lured to a restaurant by men he trusted, and then shot and killed by a team that, according to later testimonies, included ambitious younger figures like Charles Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese. With Masseria gone, Maranzano emerged as the apparent victor. He set about reorganizing the Italian underworld in New York, declaring himself a kind of supreme coordinator. As part of this reordering, Maranzano divided the city's Italian gangs into several major families, each with its own boss, underboss, and hierarchy, and all supposedly reporting ultimately to him. In that arrangement, Gagliano was confirmed as head of what had once been Reina's organization. The Bronx and East Harlem region that Reina had controlled now formed the heart of a recognized family within the new structure. Law enforcement over time would come to call it by its bosses' names, the Reina family, then the Gagliano family, and eventually, after another leadership change, the Lucchese family. In these developments, the echo of Gaetano Reina's choices could be heard. He had been the first clearly established boss of that Bronx-based group. He had shaped its money-making methods, chosen its early lieutenants, and set the tone for its style: quiet, disciplined, focused on stable income rather than flashy displays. Even after his death, the men he had trained and trusted carried forward that pattern, fitting it into the changing architecture of organized crime in New York. Within a few months of his victory, Maranzano himself fell. In September 1931, he was killed in his office by a team aligned with Luciano, who believed that Maranzano intended to betray and possibly eliminate him and other younger leaders. After that, Luciano and his allies created a more balanced arrangement, a commission of bosses from the major families, meant to limit future wars by requiring consultation and agreement on large decisions. In that setting, Gagliano's voice represented the Bronx family once led by Reina. He was not the loudest or most forceful character at the table. He preferred to manage his territory quietly, relying on long-standing revenue streams rather than chasing every new opportunity. This kept his family relatively stable for many years, even as law enforcement pressures and internal rivalries reshaped other organizations. For the city as a whole, the period that followed saw organized crime become more structured, more businesslike, but no less harmful to those caught in its grip. Ordinary people still faced extortion, still had their shops used for hidden gambling, still found themselves trapped in unforgiving loans. The particular names changed. Reina was gone. Others took his place. The systems remained. Looking back on Reina's life from this later vantage point, a picture emerges that is neither romantic nor entirely simple. He had arrived in America as a poor teenager, facing prejudice and hard labor. Through effort and sharp observation, he climbed to a position of considerable influence. But the path he chose into extortion, illegal monopolies, and participation in higher-level criminal alliances brought profit at the expense of many neighbors' independence and safety. His decisions helped create a pattern of organized corruption that would trouble New York for decades. At the same time, his measured style and avoidance of reckless violence left a different imprint than some of his peers. Within the underworld, he was remembered as thoughtful, slow to anger, and inclined to settle disputes in ways that did not always end with blood on the street. That did not undo the harm of his rackets, but it shaped the character of the organization he built. In the Bronx neighborhoods where he once ruled, time moved on. Families relocated. New immigrants arrived from different countries. The ice trucks disappeared as electric refrigerators became common. Coal gave way to oil and gas. Children who had grown up watching Reina's drivers unload heavy blocks for their mothers' kitchens became adults in a city that no longer needed such deliveries. Yet in police files, court transcripts, and the memories of older residents, his name lingered. Detectives piecing together the history of what later became known as the Lucchese family traced many of its customs and structures back to the era when a small, serious man from Corleone used ice and coal as the front for a criminal network. Investigators studying labor racketeering and delivery unions discovered roots and practices first shaped during his tenure. By then, decades after his death, the boy who once stepped off a ship into New York Harbor had become a figure of history. His story was told in fragments in a line from a court case here, a mention in a memoir there, a few paragraphs in law enforcement summaries. For most people, he was just a name, overshadowed by more flamboyant gangsters whose exploits made better headlines. But for those who looked carefully at the foundations of organized crime in the Bronx, his role was impossible to ignore. On a gray morning in the early 1932, men leaning at Bronx cafe counters still used his name in low voices. They would say, "In Tommy's time, this route was his." Or, "Back when Reina was running things, that club paid on Thursdays." The man himself had been in the ground for years, yet his habits still guided how money moved, who collected from which street, and how arguments were settled. The trucks looked the same. The faces changed slowly. One of the younger men who lived in that in-between world was a driver and messenger named Joseph Valakai. He had grown up in tough tenements, learned to fend for himself early, and drifted into petty theft and street games. In his 20s, he came under the influence of the Bronx organization that had once answered to Gaetano Reina. By the time Valakai began working regularly with them, the old boss was already gone, but the older soldiers talked about him so often that Valakai felt as if he had known him longer. He remembered first seeing Reina from a distance in the late 1920 seconds before the murder. The impression stayed with him. A compact man dressed neatly but not showily, moving through the neighborhood with an air of quiet command. Nobody made a fuss when Reina entered a cafe. Men simply straightened, nodded respectfully, and lowered their voices. There were no grand speeches. Business was discussed in murmurs, then people went back to their coffee. After the killing, Valakai found himself working under the men who had been closest to Reina, especially Gaetano Gagliano and Tommy Lucchese. They kept many of the same rackets alive. Ice still had to be delivered. Numbers game still needed collectors. Debts had to be enforced. When he ran errands, Valakai heard constant comparisons to the way Tommy used to do it. The man who was gone became, in a sense, the standard. Over time, Valakai was drawn deeper in. He ran messages between clubs, helped transport betting slips, and sometimes rode along on collection runs. The organization treated him as one of their own. Through that work, he met a young woman from the old Reina family, one of Gaetano's daughters. Her name was Carmela. Their relationship grew in small steps. They met at gatherings, talked cautiously, and discovered that despite the darkness around them, they wanted something ordinary. A home, children, a little safety in a world where safety always seemed uncertain. In 1932, they married. The dead boss, whose name everyone still invoked, now became Valakai's father-in-law, at least in memory. Inside that household, the picture of Gaetano was more complicated. To his widow and daughters, he was not the head of a mafia family. He was a husband who had provided food, shelter, and a kind of protection, then vanished with almost no warning one winter evening. They did not talk easily about his darker activities. Pain and pride mixed in their silences. Carmela knew her father had business, and that men in the neighborhood had respected him, but she did not dwell on the details. The trauma of his murder lived somewhere just under the surface. Valakai, now linked to Reina's bloodline, carried that dual image with him, the underworld figure whose name made policemen frown, and the family man whose absence still hurt his wife and mother-in-law. He learned little bits here and there, stories about how Gaetano insisted his children study, how he corrected their table manners, how he never allowed loud fighting in the home. Those memories sat alongside accounts from the streets about ice monopolies, protection money, and the meeting where Reina had been warned, too late, that he was in danger. Through the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, the organization that Reina had built continued under Gagliano's careful hand. It shifted focus as the city changed. Ice remained important for a time, but mechanical refrigeration slowly began to appear in more apartments and shops. The old ice monopoly could not last forever. Reina's heirs in the underworld adapted, applying the same methods, threats, union influence, selective violence to trucking, markets, and other industries that relied on shipping and storage. The basic pattern, however, still bore his mark. The Bronx and East Harlem group preferred steady, quiet income. They avoided spectacular crimes that brought instant headlines. They prized long-term hold-on unions and routes more than risky one-time scores. This trait distinguished them from some flasher organizations that chased every new opportunity with bold, reckless moves. Carmela and Joe built their life inside that environment. They had a child. Valakai tried, in his own way, to keep some distance between his criminal work and his family life, much as Reina had attempted years earlier. He did not share details of violent disputes or elaborate extortion schemes at the dinner table. He did not come home bragging about threats made or beatings delivered. But the tension seeped in anyway, the sudden absences, the tightness in his face when rumors of arrests spread, the knowledge that the men he met in cafes were watched by the police. Outside their world, the larger American public knew little about the structure behind these activities. Journalists wrote about racketeers and gang bosses without a clear sense of the deep internal rules connecting them. Law enforcement gathered memos and lists, but they often lacked a full picture. Reina's name, when it appeared in official documents, was usually part of backward-looking notes, a mention of the ice racket of the 20s, a reference to an unsolved Bronx killing in 1930, a hint at a predecessor to Gagliano's quiet regime. In the late 1,940 seconds and early 1,950 seconds, the country's attention turned more directly toward organized crime. High-profile investigations began probing gambling cartels, labor racketeering, and connections between criminals and politicians. The Kefauver Committee, a series of Senate hearings chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver, dragged underworld figures into public view. Some witnesses refused to answer questions, invoking their rights. Others told partial truths. Through it all, an outline of something more structured than random gangs began to emerge. The Bronx outfit, descended from Reina's old family, mostly kept its head down. Its boss, Gaetano Reina, rarely appeared. Health problems and natural caution kept him away from the spotlight. Increasingly, his capable underboss, Tommy Lucchese, handled more of the family's day-with-day affairs and represented their interests in dealings with other groups. Lucchese had learned at Reina's side, then helped guide the organization through the bloody Castellamarese War and into the more regulated era of the Commission. When Gagliano died or stepped aside in the early 1952, law enforcement sources differ slightly on dates because of his secrecy. Lucchese assumed full control. The group that had started as Reina's Bronx family was now widely known in police circles as the Lucchese family. Yet in internal conversations and historical notes, Reina's role as founder was not forgotten. Charts compiled by investigators traced the line clearly. Reina, then Gagliano, then Lucchese. In November 1957, a meeting on a quiet estate near the village of Appalachian in upstate New York shocked both the public and officialdom. Dozens of underworld figures from around the country gathered there to discuss business and resolve disputes. Local state troopers, suspicious of the sudden influx of expensive cars, raided the meeting. Men in tailored suits scrambled through the woods and fields, trying to escape. But many were caught. Among those nabbed was Thomas Lucchese, boss of the Bronx East Harlem family. His arrest there confirmed what many investigators had suspected. His group was one of the key components of a nationwide criminal network. In the reports that followed, officials tried to map out the leadership structure of what they now recognized as multiple families. In those diagrams, the line leading to Lucchese's name passed back through Gagliano to a figure labeled Tommy Reina, Bronx boss, killed 1,930. By the early 1960s, pressure on organized crime increased again. Federal agencies tapped phones, turned up informants, and pieced together old, unsolved cases. Among those imprisoned during this period was Joseph Valakai, now an aging soldier with decades of underworld experience behind him. Facing his own legal troubles and fearing for his life after a mistaken hit attempt inside prison, Valakai did something almost unheard of at his level. He decided to cooperate openly with the government. In 1963, seated before Senate investigators and later spoken to by Justice Department lawyer Peter Moss, Valakai described in detail the inner workings of the Italian-American criminal society he knew as Cosa Nostra. He talked about initiation rituals, hierarchy, rules, and the commission. He named bosses, underbosses, and soldiers. His information became the backbone of a public understanding of the Mafia's structure, much of which historians still consider broadly accurate. When he looked back across his own life in crime, Valakai naturally spoke of the bosses he had served. At the beginning of that chain, in his telling, stood the man whose daughter he had married, Gaetano, Tommy Reina. To the senators and attorneys around the table, the name was a piece of history from an earlier era, but to Valakai, it was personal. He recounted how, as a young man, he had been drawn into the Bronx ring that reported to Reina. He described Reina as reserved, businesslike, and relatively fair with his men, at least by the harsh standards of their world. He noted that Reina's main legitimate front was the ice business, and that his criminal strength came from the grip he held over that trade and related unions. Valakai also repeated what he had come to believe about Reina's death, that he had been killed on orders from Joe the Boss Masseria, because he was suspected of preparing to side with the Castellamarese camp of Salvatore Maranzano. Valakai named Vito Genovese as the likely triggerman, a claim echoed by other informants and later adopted by many historians. Though, as always in such matters, absolute proof was never presented in court. For Carmela, still living quietly far from the bright lights of the hearings, hearing her husband speak publicly about her father must have been wrenching. They had long avoided discussing the bitter details of the murder directly. Now the story was laid out for the whole country. In his testimony, Valakai tried to balance respect and honesty. He did not hide Reina's criminal role, but he spoke without mockery, or gloating. Years of living with the consequences of that world had stripped any glamour from it. Through Valakai's words, Reina entered the official record in a new way. Until then, knowledge of his life and activities had been scattered, residing in fading memories of older detectives and brief mentions in yellowed newspaper clippings. Now his name appeared in congressional transcripts, FBI files, and besto-selling books about the underworld. Journalists writing about Cosa Nostra's early days in New York began including him as one of the first clear bosses of what would become a major crime family. Investigators studying labor racketeering in New York's food and delivery sectors traced some of the problems they faced back to the patterns set in place during Reina's years. The idea of taking over an essential service, such as ICE, then using that control to extort customers and leverage unions. This template had been copied and adapted again and again. Even when the product changed from ICE to refrigerated trucking or warehouse services, the underlying method remained much the same. For law enforcement trying to dismantle entrenched rackets, understanding those roots mattered. They could see that these arrangements were not random outbreaks of greed, but the continuation of systems crafted decades earlier by figures like Reina and refined by their successors. The ghost of the quiet Bronx ICE boss lingered in line items on cargo manifests and names on union rosters. At the same time, the human side of his story did not vanish. Elderly residents of East Harlem in the Bronx, interviewed in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds by researchers and reporters, sometimes mentioned him when asked about the old days. They recalled a short man with a serious face, who walked with his hands clasped behind his back, who never made scenes in public, who seemed to have a say in everything without ever shouting. Some spoke of being afraid of his men. Others remembered him handing a few coins to a struggling mother or smoothing over a family dispute. For them, he was neither a legend nor a caricature, just another complicated figure who had moved through their difficult world. By then, nearly 40 years had passed since the shotgun blast on Sheridan Avenue. The city had changed almost beyond recognition. New highways cut through old neighborhoods. Waves of migrants from the American South and Puerto Rico had joined earlier Italian and Irish communities. Old tenements were replaced by newer apartment blocks. Coal and ice deliveries belonged to another era. The Mafia itself, though still powerful, faced new pressures from wiretaps, undercover agents, and harsher prison sentences. Yet somewhere in that vast, changing city, the last people who had actually seen Reina with their own eyes were growing old. Their accounts, combined with Valakai's testimony and scattered official papers, formed the backbone of what could be known about him. No diaries of his surfaced, no long letters. His voice survives only secondhand, in remembered phrases and reported conversations. That limited record makes it impossible to draw a complete portrait. What emerges instead is an outline. A Sicilian farm boy shaped by poverty and a culture of local power brokers. An immigrant laborer who saw in New York's confusion a chance to rise. A man who built a criminal empire around an honesty-seeming commodity. A leader who preferred order and quiet but did not hesitate to rely on intimidation and, through his organization, violence. A husband and father whose choices brought comfort to his own household while extracting it from many others. A boss whose death signaled a turn in a wider underworld war. In the last decades of the 20th century, historians and crime writers filled in that outline as best they could. They compared police files, immigration records, and oral histories. They placed Reina among the early wave of mafia bosses who helped transform a loose collection of ethnic gangs into a system with enduring national reach. In studies of the Lucchese family's origins, his name appears at the top of the list of bosses, the starting point of a line that stretches forward through Gagliano, Lucchese, and later leaders. From a distance, it might seem that his life was swallowed entirely by that criminal legacy. But for his descendants, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who grew up hearing only hints about the man in the old photographs, the picture is more mixed. For them, he is part family myth, part cautionary tale, part unanswered question. They walk streets that are safer than the ones he knew, in a city with different problems and different corruptions, carrying a surname that once made detectives raise their eyebrows and now passes mostly without comment. In that sense, the story of Gaetano Reina did not end with the echo of a gunshot or the ceiling of a grave. It continued in the slow fading of fear in certain neighborhoods, in the long work of law enforcement to undo systems he helped create, and in the quiet efforts of his own family to build lives far removed from the world that consumed him. By the time the 1,960 seconds faded into the 1,970 seconds, most of the men who had actually sat across a table from Gaetano Reina were gone. Some had died in their beds, some in prison, some in quiet, unexplained incidents in side streets. A few were still around, retired in modest houses, their memories reaching back to a time when ice blocks and coal sacks were at the center of everything. For younger detectives and prosecutors trying to understand how New York's criminal networks really worked, those memories were valuable. They would visit old officers who had once walked Bronx beats, or flip through yellowing notebooks stored in police archives. On some pages, in cramped handwriting, a name appeared again and again. T. Reina, Tommy R. Reina Gang, Ice Racket, Bronx, Reina. In that way, the man who had died on Sheridan Avenue in 1930 became part of a different story, one about how the law gradually learned to see more clearly what it was up against. The turning point had already begun with the testimony of people like Joseph Valakai. Once Valakai spoke openly about the idea of a structured society, what he called Cosa Nostra, with bosses, underbosses, and soldiers. Investigators went back over old cases with new eyes. A killing that had seemed like a random feud now looked connected to a chain of decisions stretching upward through several layers. When they looked at the Bronx and East Harlem, the pattern was plain. In the earliest phase of that structure, the name at the top was Reina's. Agents assembled timelines on big sheets of paper. They wrote Reina near the start of the New York branch that would eventually be called the Lucchese family. Under his name, they listed the major rackets he had developed or expanded: control of ice distribution, domination of certain coal routes, pressure over delivery and building service unions, collection from gambling dens, and participation in bootlegging during Prohibition. Next to that, they added notes on methods, use of front businesses, reliance on silent intimidation, preference for monopolies and basic services rather than loud, one-time robberies. They saw that later bosses in that line, Gagliano, then Lucchese, had followed many of the same patterns, even when the specific commodity changed from ice to refrigerated trucks or other services. At the same time, the country passed new tools for dealing with organized crime. In 1970, Congress created the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO. Instead of treating each act of extortion, bribery, or illicit gambling as a separate offense, RICO allowed prosecutors to argue that they were all part of one ongoing criminal enterprise. That made it easier to aim cases not just at street-level enforcers, but at the leaders who planned and benefited from the whole system. When lawyers drew up RICO indictments in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds against figures in the Lucchese family, they sometimes reached back to older history to show that the organization was not a recent invention. In internal memos, they mentioned Reina's control of ice and unions as early examples of the same pattern of racketeering they now sought to punish. His name did not always appear in public court papers, but the dossiers used to prepare those cases often began their family histories with him. Meanwhile, academics and writers took an interest in the roots of the Mafia in America. They traveled to Corleone and other Sicilian towns, searched Ellis Island records, and matched old ship passenger lists with New York arrest logs. In that process, details of Gaetano's early life became clearer. Researchers confirmed his birth in Corleone in 1889, his arrival in the United States as a teenager, and his first recorded connections to the Morello Group in East Harlem. They dug into old Italian-language newspapers published in New York in the early 1900s. In their brittle pages, they found cautious reports about extortion in immigrant neighborhoods, about black hand letters, about mysterious societies that offered protection for a price. Names were rarely printed in full, but sometimes initials and addresses matched up with known figures. Slowly, a picture emerged of how men like Reina had moved from simple messengers and collectors to regional bosses. On the other side of the ocean, Italian scholars also examined coroner reports and police files from Sicily, trying to trace which families had connections to early mafia groups there. Corleone's long, tangled history with rural crime and local men of honor came into focus. Though direct documents tying the young Gaetano to specific Sicilian incidents were scarce, the cultural atmosphere that shaped him could be seen clearly. A world where distrust of the state was common, and where private power brokers filled the space between ordinary people and distant authorities. As all this research accumulated, Reina's image shifted from a shadowy name in a crime story to a more complex figure at the intersection of migration, poverty, and organized crime. He was no longer just the Bronx ice racketeer killed in 1930. He was also an example of how certain social conditions crowded immigrant districts. Weak labor protections, discrimination, and corrupt local officials created space for someone to step in and rule outside the law. None of this excused his actions. Historians writing about him made that plain, but they tried to understand why so many people in those days accepted his authority, or at least tolerated it. One answer lay in the lack of realistic help for small business owners and tenants. If a shopkeeper was robbed, he could call the police, but often nothing came of it. If he went to Reina's men, they might actually find the thief, or at least promise that such a thing would not happen again. The price for that service was regular payment and the loss of independence. Decades later, when law enforcement finally made serious inroads against Mafia influence in unions and essential industries, they adopted some practices that answered those old problems more directly. Witness protection programs, confidential tip lines, and specialized units for organized crime gave people who were being extorted more realistic options than they had had in Reina's time. In the neighborhoods where he had once been strongest, the physical signs of his era faded. The coal dust that once hung in the air disappeared as buildings converted to other fuels. The clatter of ice tongs and the slide of blocks down sawdust-coated chutes went silent when electric refrigerators became cheap enough for most families. Old ice houses were converted to storage or torn down. Children who grew up in the 1970 seconds heard about ice delivery as something their grandparents remembered, like gas lamps and horse-drawn wagons. Yet traces of his influence lingered in less visible ways. In certain unions tied to trucking and food distribution, investigators uncovered long-standing practices of kickbacks and no-show jobs, reserved for people with connections to the Lucchese family. Testimony in some of those cases mentioned that these arrangements had always been this way, going back to the days when ice and coal were the main cargoes. That always reached back to Reina's era. Families who had been on the receiving end of such systems carried their own memories. A retired grocer might tell his children about having to pay 2 different bills every month. One to the actual ice company, another in cash to a man who handled problems. An elderly tenant might recall the way certain landlords seemed unusually worried about whether the right delivery firm was used. They did not always attach the name Reina to those stories, but the structure had been his. Within the Italian-American community, attitudes toward the old Mafia figures grew more critical as time went on. In the mid-20th century, some people had spoken about men like Reina with a kind of grim respect, seeing them as products of a hard age. By the end of the century, after many public trials and revelations, more voices condemned the damage these organizations had done to union democracy, to neighborhood businesses, to the reputation of Italian Americans as a whole. Community leaders and cultural groups worked to separate their heritage from organized crime. They promoted stories of teachers, scientists, artists, and ordinary workers rather than gangsters. In that context, the legacy of early bosses like Reina became something to acknowledge honestly but not admire. He represented a path that some had taken, often out of desperation and ambition, but not a path to be followed. Law enforcement circles, too, reassessed the early period. In the 1920 seconds, officers had sometimes treated the killings tied to Mafia disputes as if they were almost inevitable gang wars beyond serious control. Later generations of detectives looked back with a more critical eye, noting missed chances to prosecute extortion rackets or protect witnesses. They studied the failures of those earlier efforts to improve their own approach, so that future Reinas could not so easily build hidden monopolies in basic services. By the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds, big cases against the Lucchese family and other New York crime groups brought long prison sentences for many high-ranking members. Undercover agents recorded conversations in social clubs and restaurants where, years before, men like Reina had conducted their business without fear of listening ears. The structure he had helped found in the Bronx was battered but not completely gone. Nevertheless, it faced more pressure and disruption than he could have imagined. In some of those wiretapped conversations, older mobsters mentioned his name in passing, often as a reference point. Back when Tommy had this, it was different. Or, since Reina's time, this line has been ours. For them, he was part of their internal history, a kind of founding figure whose choices still affected how their piece of the underworld thought about itself. Even as they talked about modern problems, electronic surveillance, federal sentencing guidelines, they measured their present against an inherited past that began, for their corner of the city, with him. Outside that underworld, teenagers walking along Sheridan Avenue or through the side streets of what had once been ICE delivery territory had little idea of the events that had taken place there generations ago. They passed apartment buildings without knowing that in front of one of them, a winter's afternoon had ended the career of a man whose decisions still echoed, faintly, in the way their city worked. For them, the dangers they faced came from different sources: drugs, failing schools, street gangs of a new kind. The old Sicilian boss was just a name in someone else's history, yet in libraries and archives his story remained, waiting for anyone curious enough to look. A researcher sifting through a stack of crime commission reports might find a short summary. Gaetano, Tommy, Reina, born Corleone, Sicily, the 27th of August, 1889, immigrated to U.S. circa 1904, associated with Italian Black Hand and Morello Group in East Harlem, later boss of Bronx Cosa Nostra family. Major involvement in ICE distribution rackets, killed by shotgun blast the 26th of February 1930. From that bare outline, a fuller narrative could be reconstructed, drawing on census data, immigration records, marriage certificates, and old photographs where perhaps a small, serious-faced man can be seen among relatives at a wedding or behind the counter of a front business. In those pictures, nothing announces, "This is a mafia boss." He simply appears as another immigrant trying to find his place in a new country. In quiet reading rooms where such images are studied, the gap between yesterday's fear and today's calm becomes very clear. A single line in a detective's notebook about Reina's ICE monopoly sits next to a modern scholar's note about urban infrastructure, labor history, and the shift from informal protection to regulated services. The same story can be read as crime history, immigrant history, business history, or social history, depending on where the focus falls. For the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who once paid as collectors, that blend can be sobering. They may discover that their grandfather's grocery store survived only because he agreed to buy ice from one company and no other. They may learn that a great-uncle's sudden promotion in a union was tied to a handshake in a back room where Reina or his men sat at the table. Those realizations can bring a complicated pride in their relatives' endurance, mixed with anger at the subtle chains that had bound them. As the 20th century closed, crime writers often looked for colorful, larger-life figures to anchor their stories, flamboyant bosses who favored expensive suits and bold moves. Compared to them, Reina seemed quiet, even plain. He did not build casinos in the desert or host national gatherings in fancy hotels. His empire was made of warehouse blocks, tenement basements, union offices, and the humble ice truck. Yet in some ways, that made his story more telling. It showed how organized crime could flourish not only in spectacular heists or luxury settings, but also in the routines of everyday life who supplied a basic product, who set a price, who was allowed to operate in a given street. His career demonstrated that power could be exercised just as effectively with a calm word and a stranglehold on an essential service as with a dramatic act of violence. Long after the last ice block melted from New York's kitchens, the lesson held. Wherever systems are opaque, where people feel they have nowhere to turn, and where a small group can quietly control a necessary supply or process, the possibility exists for someone to step in as Reina once did, offering help that comes at a steep cost. That awareness shaped how regulators, consumer advocates, and law enforcement approached new industries, from waste hauling to construction and shipping. In that broader sense, the life of a single Sicilian immigrant who rose and fell in the Bronx between 1904 and 1930 helped teach a city, and eventually a country, hard truths about the conditions that feed organized crime and the long, patient work required to dismantle it. The boy from Corleone, the ice boss of the Bronx, the quiet figure whose choices harmed many and protected a few, became a case study as well as a memory. The personal story, the young man on the immigrant ship, the father at the dinner table, the boss stepping onto a cold street one February evening, remains at the core of that case. Around it stretched the consequences, the families pressured, the unions bent, the successors who carried on his methods, the laws later written to counter people like him. Together they form a long arc, one that was still being studied and debated many decades after the last person who had spoken to him in person had passed away. In the 21st century, when people talk about Corleone, they often think first of films and novels that turned the town's name into a symbol. Long before all of that, there was a real place on a rocky hill, with stone houses, narrow lanes, and families like the Reinas, who struggled from harvest to harvest. For most residents today, the old stories about men who left for America have faded into the background, replaced by concerns about jobs, schools, and the future. Somewhere in the town's records, however, a line still notes the birth of a boy named Gaetano, son of Antonio and his wife, recorded in 1889. Local historians who leaf through those volumes can trace dozens of similar names that later appear in American files, fragments of a great wave of migration that reshaped both Sicily and New York. For them, Reina is one thread in a much larger fabric. On the other side of the ocean, in New York, the traces of his life lie scattered in different places. Immigration lists show a teenager from Corleone disembarking with thousands of others. Census sheets from East Harlem list a laborer sharing cramped rooms with relatives. Police files from the 1,910 seconds and 1,920 seconds mention a Tommy linked to Italian gambling houses and suspected extortion. Business directories show ICE companies tied to his name or to trusted fronts. Taken alone, any one of those scraps does not say much. Put together, they sketch a path, from a poor village to a crowded tenement, from carrying bricks to carrying influence, from being one more immigrant in an anonymous crowd to a man whose decisions affected an entire borough's daily life. Modern researchers, with time and patience that detectives in his day did not have, piece those elements together carefully. They cross-check dates, compare addresses, and read old testimonies with a cautious eye. Knowing that fear, pride, or self-interest may have shaped what was said, they weigh Joseph Valakai's memories, understanding that he spoke decades after the events, under pressure, yet also with a certain tired honesty. They compare his account of Reina's position and death with independent police reports, confirming what fits and discarding what clearly does not. What emerges is surprisingly consistent. By the middle of the 1,920 seconds, Reina had become the recognized head of a Sicilian-American crime family based in the Bronx and East Harlem. His core business lay in controlling ice and coal deliveries, using intimidation to drive out competitors and force customers into exclusive arrangements. Beyond that front, his organization took a share from illegal gambling, ran loan sharking operations, influenced certain unions, and played a role in distributing liquor during Prohibition. He built that system, not with dramatic publicity, but with steady pressure. Drivers delivered not only blocks of ice, but also quiet messages. Union stewards knew which companies could bid freely, and which would be blocked. Bar owners understood that buying liquor from Reina's channels meant fewer headaches. Those who resisted encountered flat tires, broken windows, inspections that arrived at just the wrong time, or, in worse cases, physical assaults carried out by men who made sure not to be recognized. Violence in his world functioned as a tool rather than a spectacle. Most of his criminal work involved fear without open bloodshed. The implied threat that something might happen if people stepped out of line. Yet he operated inside a larger underworld where killings did occur. The Mafia-Camorra clashes, the Prohibition hijackings, the slow build-up to the Castellamarese conflict, all left bodies in streets and alleyways. While records rarely name Reina as the man who pulled a trigger, his position at the top of a crime family meant that he approved, or at least tolerated the use of force by his subordinates when he believed it was necessary for business. In that sense, his crimes extended beyond the direct acts of extortion or illegal gambling in which he personally engaged. He created and led an organization whose daily routines depended on unlawful coercion. The money that reached his hands flowed from a long chain of actions, some simple, like a collector taking an envelope, others harsher, like an enforcer knocking a reluctant shopkeeper to the ground. He might never have met many of the people hurt by his system, yet their struggles were part of the cost of his success. At the same time, the legal system of his era was not equipped to respond effectively. Witness protection did not exist in any modern sense. Police corruption, while not universal, was serious enough in some districts to make victims doubt that complaints would be handled fairly. Language barriers and prejudice against Italian immigrants further discouraged cooperation. When investigators tried to bring charges related to Reina's ice racket or alleged intimidation, cases often collapsed because no one would stand in court and repeat what they had said in private. Those failures helped shape his story. Had prosecutors in the 1,920 seconds been able to convict him on strong racketeering charges, he might have spent much of his later life in prison. Instead, he operated relatively freely until rivals in his own world decided he was more dangerous to them alive than gone. The justice he faced came not from courts, but from a shotgun in the hands of a rival faction. Seen from today, that ending carries its own lesson. Leaving the suppression of powerful criminal figures to other criminals does not protect communities. It simply shifts who collects the money and gives the orders. After Reina's death, his organization did not vanish. It passed to new leaders, first imposed from outside, then drawn from his own lieutenants. The ice routes, gambling dens, and loan books remained. Only the signature at the bottom changed. Over the decades, as law enforcement slowly dismantled those structures, they studied cases like his to understand how such systems take root. They learned that tackling individual crimes without addressing the underlying networks leaves the core problem untouched. They saw how control over an essential service, whether ice, trucking, waste disposal, or construction, could be turned into a durable racket if regulators were inattentive and unions were left vulnerable to infiltration. In that way, the record of Reina's activities fed directly into later reforms. Stronger oversight of public utilities and delivery monopolies, more transparent union elections, and specialized anti-racketeering units grew partly out of an effort to prevent the kind of hidden control he exercised. Each regulation or oversight board lacked drama, but together they made it harder for one man to quietly dominate a basic necessity as he had once dominated ice in the Bronx. For ordinary families, those shifts meant that choices widened. A grocery owner could select from multiple suppliers without looking over his shoulder. A building manager could hire a delivery service based on price and reliability rather than fear. That change did not come overnight. It arrived slowly, through dull hearings and routine inspections, far removed from the harsh nights when Reina's collectors moved from door to door. Yet those dry bureaucratic steps were, in their own way, the counter-story to his. On the personal side, the legacy within his own family softened with time. Children who had lost a father grew into parents and grandparents. The sharpness of grief dulled into a quieter memory. They held on to the parts of him that fit their domestic lives. His insistence on education, his careful dress, the way he refused to raise his voice in front of his children. Some may have chosen to minimize talk of his criminal role, preferring to remember the man who carried them on his shoulders or check their homework. Others, especially in younger generations, became curious about the full truth. They read books, watched documentaries, and discovered that the surname they carried once drew a different kind of attention. For some, that knowledge produced shame. For others, it stirred a more complicated reflection on how a person shaped by a harsh environment can make choices that echo far beyond his own front door. In either case, very few in his line chose to follow the exact path he had taken. They moved into professions far from racketeering, teaching, trades, regular business, seeking a quieter place in the country their ancestor had entered through Ellis Island's gates. In New York's collective memory, Reina's story sits at a crossroads of many themes: immigration, poverty, prejudice, opportunity, crime, and reform. He is part of the tale of how tightly packed neighborhoods of newcomers created their own informal power structures when official ones failed them. He is part of the history of how those structures hardened into something predatory and deeply unfair. He is also part of the account of how a city, slowly and imperfectly, learned to push back. On certain nights, if you stand on a Bronx sidewalk not far from where he once lived, the noise is different now. The rumble comes from buses and delivery vans for supermarkets, not from horse-drawn ice wagons. Voices shout in Spanish, English, Bengali, and Albanian, as well as Italian. Neon from bodegas and takeout shops glows where old social clubs once hid card tables. The specific fears that hung over the blocks in the 1,920 seconds have shifted, yet the physical space remains, carrying faint echoes of the choices made there long ago. Imagine, for a moment, the contrast between two winter evenings on that street. On one, in 1930, a man in a dark overcoat steps out of a building, thinking perhaps of business or family, and does not reach his car. On another, many years later, a student hurries home from the subway, backpack slung over one shoulder, thinking of exams or music or messages on a phone, unaware that the patch of pavement she crosses was once a key point in a hidden war over power. Between those two scenes lies the arc of Reina's life and what it set in motion. A boy left Corleone with little more than hope and a willingness to work. In New York, he saw that force and fear could open doors quicker than patience and low wages. Step by step, he built a position that gave him control over others' choices, extracting payment in cash and obedience. He supplied a kind of order in neighborhoods that lacked trust in official order, but his order came at a serious cost. For a time, his system seemed stable. Then the logic of that same violent world turned against him. The skills that had carried him from laborer to boss alliances, caution, reading moods failed in the face of a larger conflict he could not fully control. The end arrived in a heartbeat on a cold day, leaving his family bereft and his organization in other hands. What he had built did not die with him. It simply changed the name on the door. Years later, the combination of patient policing, legal reform, and changing economic structures finally began to break apart the networks that grew from his foundation. That long process did not erase the harm he and his successors had caused, but it reduced the grip they held on everyday life. In that sense, his story is both a warning and a measure of progress. A warning about how quickly hidden power can grow when people feel unprotected, and a measure of how far institutions have come in learning to respond. As you settle into sleep, picture once more the New York night where this tale began. Streets quieter than usual, radios murmuring through open windows, a city that had not yet filled its skyline with glass towers. Somewhere, a young immigrant from Sicily arrived with a bundle and a dream, not knowing that his choices would shape the lives of thousands and then become a chapter in history books. Over time, the ice melted, the coal burned out, the names on the streets changed. The memory of Gaetano Reina, the Bronx ice boss, remains in documents, testimonies, and a few fading photographs. His life reminds us how closely crime can entwine itself with ordinary needs, and how vital it is for societies to offer fairer paths so that boys stepping off ships or planes today do not feel that his road is the only one open to them. The city outside the window is different now, but its lessons, drawn in part from his rise and fall, are still at work in the laws that protect shopkeepers, the unions that guard workers, and the quiet expectation that someone delivering to your door answers to regulation, not to fear. With that in mind, the story of Gaetano Reina can be laid gently to rest for the night a real life, with real harms and real consequences, now part of the long, uneasy effort to understand and prevent the world he helped build. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Gaetano Reina here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through legacy, influence, and the early roots of New York's underworld. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.